With the successes of the aforementioned films, many of which were made on a measly budget of hundreds or even tens of thousands and grossed millions, horror had become a bona fide genre by the start of a new decade. Studios were attracted by the relatively cheap production costs and potentially enormous box office windfalls. Both a blessing and a curse, the attention towards horror led to a glut of films being released, and unfortunately, most failed to reach the magnitude and depth required to truly terrify. Scads of middling scripts, propelled by unique concepts and premises never fully fleshed out, found funding from the studios hoping to score a lucrative breakout hit. The watering down and commercialization of the genre led to an undercurrent of frivolity and comedic absurdity. The movie-viewing audience grew accustomed to the annual October release of the next preposterous installment of a slasher series. That being said, many films did identify and manipulate those subconscious weak spots which linger on the peripheries of our thoughts. Others luridly explored descents into madness, gruesome bodily metamorphosis, and bored deep into the minds of psychopaths and the deranged. In 1983, Sony released the first consumer camcorder onto the market, and it revolutionized filmmaking as it permitted truly independent films to be made. The influence of this technology leap cannot be underestimated, especially in the horror genre. Camcorders used tape instead of film, which made them not just affordable but easily maneuverable and led to an entirely new type of filmmaking, where the camera could move around nearly uninhibited. Studios have always been wary of horror, but the undeniable success of a string of classics propelled the genre into the mainstream. Accepting the genre with a skeptical eye meant many filmmakers lacking industry connections or with ideas deemed too out there to be profitable were shut out. However, the new technology gave true indie filmmakers the liberty to materialize their cinematic visions. This assured that horror would be accessible and, to a degree, open source. Scores of young filmmakers cut their teeth and experimented with the genre, which has led to a boom, as many original films and entire subgenres have arisen from indie origins. No matter the budget or the format, the best horror films appeal to our core drives and desires, leading viewers to identify with the unfortunate characters who found themselves in deadly conundrums and circumstances. The victims and protagonists often band together to fight malevolence, and since the theater experience is a communal one, there's something profound and transcendent between the horror audience and the story unfolding on screen. So here, after our little history session, we begin part 2 of our exploration of the lauded genre, this one spanning the years 1980 to 1999. Number 10, The Shining, 1980. Far from a typical ghost story, The Shining blends supernatural and psychological horror to produce a uniquely disquieting film based on the novel of the same name by Stephen King. Both King and director Stanley Kubrick were uncompromising in their art and ideas, and therefore made an awful match for collaboration, which led Kubrick to make the film largely without King's input. Kubrick changed the narrative where he deemed fit, and produced a work that came to vex King and his fans, along with many critics, but subsequently became an undisputed classic. The Shining finds professor and aspiring novelist Jack Torrance taking a position as innkeeper at an isolated hotel in the Colorado Rockies for the off-season. The hotel's remoteness means it's snowed in for most of the winter and inaccessible. Jack and his wife, along with their young son Danny, arrive to hunker down for the frigid forbidding months ahead. Jack plans to spend his abundant free time working on a novel while intermittently performing general upkeep to prevent the hotel from being damaged over the winter.
Well, that just happens to be exactly what I'm looking for. I'm outlining a new writing project, and 5 months of peace is just what I want.
Jack is battling many demons, namely alcoholism, and becomes increasingly violent and unpredictable towards his wife and son. Danny is able to view the horrific history of the hotel through extra-sensory perception and may understand what is to come next. He uses his psychic gifts to summon a rescuer who has the same abilities, which produces a tense waiting game to see if Jack will return to his senses or if the Deus Ex Machina Danny has contacted will return to prevent another gruesome chapter in the Overlook Hotel's brutal saga. Patterns and recursions underscore the film. Amongst them, the repetitive geometry of the carpet, the maze outside the hotel, Jack writing the same phrase over and over, and some of the characters themselves who may be reincarnations. The use of repetition is perhaps a reference to cabin fever and unbearable boredom. as well as the descent of a lead main character into madness and his inability to find his way out of the maze of confusion and insanity. Aided by Kubrick's ungodly meticulousness and the ambivalent nature of the storyline, much speculation has focused around minor details in the film. Room numbers, the architecture of the sets, the props and scenery have all been said to reveal secrets of the narrative. The Shining is appealing as much for the technical mastery and stellar acting performances as for the mystery of trying to decipher the clues and symbology hidden therein.
You know, some places are like people. Some shine and some don't. I guess you could say the Overlook Hotel here has something about it that's like shining.
Number 9. Poltergeist, 1982. In terrible meta-irony, the film Poltergeist is said to have cursed itself and its cast. This myth was spawned by the deaths of actresses Dominique Dunne and Heather O'Rourke. Dominique Dunne was killed by her abusive and obsessive ex-boyfriend a few months after the film was released. And Heather O'Rourke, the young actress playing Carol Ann, died of an undiagnosed intestinal disease a few years later. Both actresses suffered heart-rending deaths before their time, but there is no evidence that they were anything other than tragedies. The urban legend proposes that real skeletons were used in some of the scenes, and were the cause of the misfortunes. It is true that actual human skeletons were used as props in the film, as admitted by the crew themselves. But oddly enough, many films have used authentic human remains because they are cheaper than getting props made. Considering that the plot of Poltergeist is about the harmful unintended consequences of desecrating the dead, it is luridly ironic that the production team would do so in the process of making the film. The life-imitating art angle is so strong, a cinematic legend was bound to arise. The film itself follows a family named the Freelings, who settle in a planned community built by the land development company that Stephen Freeling works for. The unremarkable family home is pervaded by the bland suburban dream, until objects in the house seem to become animated, and the youngest member of the Freeling family, Carol Ann, is drawn to television static, as if communicating with the beyond through it. A team of parapsychologists from UC Irvine are enlisted to investigate and conclude the home is suffering from poltergeist activity. They propose the spirits are attracted to Carol Ann's youthful energy and light, after their repose was disturbed by the construction of the house. Stephen Freeling learns that when his development company is in need of land, they often buy abandoned cemeteries and relocate the graves. Or not. The sinister spirits evoked by greed, the otherworldly draw of the television, when the medium becomes the message, our increasingly anthropomorphic view of our possessions, the encroachment of humanity on nature, and the toil and death of those on whose backs suburbia sits, are all concepts evoked through subtext. Poltergeist conjures the harmful banalities of the modern world that have lost their perniciousness through ubiquity, and reintroduces them with unignorably terrifying qualities.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh, come on. I mean, that's sacrilegious, isn't it?
Oh, don't worry about it. After all, it's not ancient tribal burial ground. It's just people. Besides, we've done it before.
When?
In 76. Right down there.
Number 8. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. Director Wes Craven found inspiration for this film after reading about a series of eerie deaths amongst East Asian refugees who found harbor in California after fleeing the Vietnam War. The middle-aged men, predominantly of Hmong ethnicity, began suffering nightmares so vivid and ghastly they started refusing to sleep. Some became convinced they'd die if they did, and the prophecy often proved true, as many did in fact pass away suddenly in the middle of the night. Craven wanted the nocturnal killer, Freddy Krueger, to be the most atrocious thing he could imagine, and he came to rest upon child murderer. The figure of Freddy was formed by a combination of Craven's own experiences. Freddy is based on a childhood bully and a deformed homeless man Wes Craven viewed outside his window late one night as a child, which terrified him so deeply the image remained with him into adulthood. The best horror film directors have an ever-watching eye for what may play negatively on human psychology. So when Wes Craven learned that red and green were the greatest color clash for the human retina, he made those the hues of Freddy's infamous sweater. The premise of the film is that Freddy has returned from the dead to exact revenge on the children of the parents who caused his death. In life, Freddy Krueger avoids punishment for his awful crimes after he's released from prison on a technicality, which prompts local parents to form a vigilante mob to ensure he pays for his misdeeds. Freddy chillingly decides that parents cannot protect their children in their dreams, so that is where he'll inflict his vengeance. Freddy is the worst type of adult and acts as a representation of the dread inherent in maturity as the harshness of the world begins to destroy childish innocence, as was experienced by Craven himself. Nightmare on Elm Street blurs the line between reverie and reality to make you question if they are truly such different things. Number 7. Hellraiser, 1987. Hellraiser is the directional debut of British novelist Clive Barker, who would later become a Titian of horror. Based on a novella called The Hellbound Heart, Hellraiser is a sadomasochistic phantasmagoria about the extremes of indulgence, violence, and desire. Frank Cotton, a man who believes he has exhausted all sensual earthly experiences, searches out a puzzle box proclaimed to be a portal to a new realm of sensations. He locates the box and summons a race called Cenobites from another dimension. In their world, the gruesome-looking Cenobites are unable to differentiate between pain and pleasure, which makes their existence an endless, sadistic bacchanal. The Cenobites and their leader, Pinhead, were meant to be secondary characters in the series, but the needle-headed antagonist was a favorite amongst audiences and became the star of the franchise. The film highlights the hell that can arise from mindlessly pursuing pleasure. The puzzle box can no doubt stand in for any of the devices with their hooks into our emotions, which grant access to the honeypot of the internet that is filled with community and approbation, but also anxiety and viciousness.
What kind of doors?
Doors to the pleasures of heaven or hell. I didn't care which. I thought I'd gone to the limits. I hadn't. The Cenobites gave me an experience beyond the limits.
Number 6. Pumpkinhead, 1988. A tale of revenge gone demonically awry, Pumpkinhead concerns a humble store owner, Ed Harley, whose only son is killed in an accident caused by reckless testosterone-teeming daredevils. The grief-stricken father recalls folktales and backwoods legends about a woman who can reportedly reanimate the dead. Ed seeks out the archaic woman, who informs him the ability to raise the dead is not within her powers. However, she offers him the chance to evoke the demon of vengeance. Ed succumbs to anger and agrees to follow the witch's instructions to unleash Pumpkinhead on those responsible for his son's death. Ed quickly regrets what he has done and attempts to undo the sinister actions he has set in motion before the devilish fiend produces mass carnage. Pumpkinhead is a parable about how revenge leaves no one unscathed.
Pumpkinhead. Yo, stop! There ain't no Pumpkinhead.
What about old Mr. Foley?
He moved away.
Pumpkinhead got it. Teared off his head and drank all the blood.
Did not.
Did too.
Shut up, Hesse.
Keep away from Pumpkinhead unless you're tired of living.
His enemies are mostly dead. He's mean and unforgiving.
Number 5. Jacob's Ladder, 1990. Jacob's Ladder is a jarring psychological horror film that pulls you into a surreal world of nightmarish hallucinations and recollections suffered by its protagonist. Jacob Singer is an infantryman fighting in the Vietnam War who is surrounded by fellow soldiers succumbing to the stress of the battle with major disturbances and symptoms. The lingering trauma seems to affect Jacob when he returns home and begins suffering grisly visions and delusive experiences, which throw the past and present into a maelstrom of delusions and memories. To make sense of his own history, Jacob must confront his current confused and surreal environment to understand how he arrived here. The title, Jacob's Ladder, is a reference to the biblical figure Jacob, who had a dream of a ladder connecting heaven and earth, which permitted angels and spirits to ascend and descend. The film also quotes Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, who proposed that hell is not an awful place, but instead somewhere you can burn off the pieces of your life you can't leave behind, and once unburdened of mortal worries, you can then move on, or in this case, up the ladder. The film is about facing down episodes of your past in order to let go of them, so you can liberate yourself and find peace going forward.
He said the only thing that burns in hell is the part of you that won't let go of your life. Your memories, your attachments, they burn them all away. But they're not punishing you, he said. They're freeing your soul. Relax. Good.
Number 4. The Silence of the Lambs, 1991. Silence of the Lambs is the first horror film to win Best Picture, but its success went even further as it swept all 5 major categories at the Academy Awards. A psychological thriller in the truest sense, the film centers around Clarice Starling, an FBI trainee who is brought onto the case of a serial killer dubbed Buffalo Bill. She is directed by the agency's behavioral science unit to interview captured serial killer Hannibal Lecter, an aristocratic cannibal and former psychiatrist, for his insight into the case. Dr. Lecter, unlike most serial killers, is a cultured genius and highly offended by rudeness and lack of decorum. He was once in the ranks of the Baltimore elite and was a board member of the Baltimore Philharmonic Orchestra. That is, before he covertly fed his fellow board members parts of a flautist he killed for his poor musicianship. Hannibal Lecter uses his towering intellect to amuse himself by manipulating those around him, which creates a psychological cat-and-mouse game between he and Clarice, wherein she is forced to decipher the enigmatic clues and hints he divulges. Dr. Lecter claims to know who Buffalo Bill is, but rather than spoiling the fun, he devises a complex series of circumstances, which test Clarice's mettle as she must face her fears. The film plays on the public's desire to understand the minds of monsters, to ensure they are fundamentally different from themselves. It also appeals to another segment of the population who wish to find intellect and creative flair in serial killers. There is a market for murderabilia, the collectors of which wish to purchase objects and possessions related to serial killers, with the holy grail being paintings, poems, writings, and any other kind of art made by serial killers. Many murderers are painfully bland and cliché, but there is a subset who elude easy classification and comprehension. Hannibal Lecter is of the variety of killer whose brilliance both captivates and repulses us.
I was so scared to look inside, but I had to.
What did you see, Clarice? What did you see?
Lambs. They were screaming.
They were slaughtering the spring lambs?
They were screaming.
Number 3. Candyman, 1992. Adapted from a Clive Barker short story dealing with British classism, Candyman was reworked in an American context to portray historical oppression and its effects on inner-city communities. The Cabrini Green projects in Chicago were chosen as the setting because of their reputation for crime and governmental neglect. Candyman was a late 19th century artist who was popular in elite white society as a portrait painter. After falling in love with one of the women he is commissioned to paint and fathering a child with her, he is set upon by a lynch mob who murder him in gruesome fashion and spread his ashes on what is now Cabrini Green. A college student writing her thesis on the myth of Candyman, which is popular amongst the current residents of the projects, finds that the legend is more than fiction, and she herself becomes embroiled in the mythology of Candyman's frightful legacy. The film itself uses real urban legends as part of the plot. The Bloody Mary legend purports that if you chant her name in a mirror with the lights off, an apparition will appear. Candyman takes over as the spirit which is conjured through uttering its name. A second urban legend used in the film is actually based on a real-life event. Ruthie McCoy was an elderly woman who lived in an apartment complex near Cabrini Green and called the police one evening to report that she could hear people moving around and trying to climb through her walls. The dispatcher did not take her call seriously, but officers were sent to the address after receiving additional calls about screams and gunshots. When Ruthie did not reply, the officers forced their way through the locked door to find her dead. For maintenance purposes, there were passageways between apartments, which could be accessed through removing medicine cabinets in either apartment. Ruthie had been killed by thieves who climbed into her bathroom to rob her.
I think her name was Ruthie Jean, and she heard this banging and smashing like somebody was trying to make a hole in the wall. So Ruthie called 911, and she said there's somebody coming through the walls, and they didn't believe her.
They thought the lady was crazy, right?
Mm-hmm. So she called 911 again, and they still didn't believe her. But when they finally got there, she was dead.
In keeping with the leitmotif of the times, whether inadvertently or not, many of these films touch on the philosophical trend of postmodernism. Many movies of the era feature meta-narratives and include legends about legends, which themselves become legendary. Life turns to art and then back to life, and vice versa. You are impelled to question reality itself and how stories and fables are fashioned, and whether the line between fact and fiction is so strong. Candyman, for its part, illustrates how history is never really dead and continues to haunt our present, often in the most brutal ways.
Dozens of hives filled with hungry bees. They smashed the hives and stole the honeycomb and smeared it over his prone, naked body. Candyman was stung to death by the bees. It burned his body on a giant pyre.
Number 2. Scream, 1996. Scream was the progenitor of an iconic character called Ghostface, who would become a Halloween steadfast throughout the 90s and beyond. The antagonist's memorable mask was inspired by an expressionist painting titled The Scream by Edvard Munch, which features a shrieking man evocative of anguish. Scream is a black comedy and parody of slasher flicks, and the absurdity that permeated their explosion in the 80s. The characters openly discuss and mock horror film tropes, reminding the audience they are watching a movie, which is usually considered a faux pas. But with the increasing tendency of horror films to be self-referential, it began to be considered a plot device to counterintuitively bring the audience in on the film. Another theme on this list is films taking inspiration from the news, and Scream was written by Kevin Williamson after encountering news stories about the Gainesville Ripper, who went on a killing spree over the span of a week targeting college students. Perhaps due to the inspiration, the media plays a prominent role in the film, with a media circus forming around the story of murdered high school students. Directed by Wes Craven, Scream is a twisty whodunit about a group of teenagers embroiled in paranoia and speculation as the mysterious killer Ghostface begins targeting them. Screenwriter Kevin Williamson was also inspired by his favorite horror films, but subverted them for the pleasure of a modern audience. Likewise, he critiqued and mocked the news media and teenage culture. Long before phones became smart, kids were still transfixed with them, except in the form of speaking on landlines. Ghostface uses the telephone to stalk and terrify his victims, which resonated amongst teenagers watching the film. However, in another gruesomely ironic quirk, some teenagers would become so enthralled with the film and Ghostface, they would commit atrocious crimes in its name, each of which made international headlines.
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
I don't know.
You have to have a favorite. What comes to mind?
Halloween. You know, the one with the guy in the white mask who walks around and stalks babysitters?
Number 1. The Blair Witch Project, 1999. The Blair Witch Project is an unlikely tour de force that single-handedly precipitated the flurry of found footage films that would deluge the horror market in the aughts. The concept of the film was developed by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez while still in film school. They posited that documentaries about paranormal investigations were often scarier than horror films, so why not combine the two? They cobbled together around $60,000 to bring their idea of a supernatural pseudo-documentary to fruition. The film went on to gross over $200 million in the box office, in part due to a brilliant marketing campaign. The movie-viewing public was so unaccustomed to seeing such unabashedly lo-fi quality, and rather than being a hindrance, it was used to drive home the realism. A clever internet promotional campaign was undertaken to convince the public the actors had in fact disappeared. Fake clips and interviews of people purportedly familiar with the case were posted online, and instead of traditional movie posters, those for the Blair Witch were missing persons posters featuring a triptych of the main characters. The ploy worked, and many truly believed the footage and story were real. The film about an urban legend intentionally became an urban legend itself. The Blair Witch Project features 3 unknown actors, which also aided the notion that what was occurring was real. Said to be film students who decided to investigate the local legend of the Blair Witch. During their search in the deep woods, they vanish, but leave behind their camera, which is subsequently found, hence the found footage label. The Blair Witch Project and its meta ad campaign, along with usage of the internet, which was far from a common promotional tool at the time, perfectly captured the zeitgeist of the times. It was part of the first generation of horror films that played on our increasing tendency to live our lives on camera and capitalized on the growing anxiety of the new digital millennium.
And they say that the woods are all haunted up there and stuff like that, but What do they say? How are they
Well,
haunted?
there really isn't many people that say that it's haunted, but there was this old woman, Mary Brown.
Mary Brown?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And she was kind of crazy lady.
How was she seen by the community?
Crazy.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and clang that bell if you want more.